Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a massive challenge that leaders all over the world face. How do you roll out tough but totally necessary economic reforms without, causing a political meltdown? Well, it turns out the answer often boils down to a choice between two very, very different strategies. So here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll look at what we're calling the reformer's dilemma. Then, we'll unpack the two big approaches, shock therapy versus gradualism. After that, we'll get into the secret ingredient for what actually makes these things work. And then, the really cool part, we'll see it all play out in a real-world experiment in Iran, and finally, draw out a huge lesson for the entire world. All right, so for a lot of developing countries, subsidizing essentials like fuel, well, that's not just a policy, it's a political lifeline. But the problem is, these subsidies can become an economic death spiral, just sucking the national budget dry. And this creates this huge paradox. What's good for politics can be absolutely terrible for the economy. And that leads to the million-dollar question, right? One that dozens of nations are wrestling with right now. How do you get rid of a really popular subsidy without everything blowing up in your face? The answer usually falls into one of two major schools of thought, two totally different ways of ripping off that economic Band-Aid. Okay, so let's get into these two paths, shock therapy and gradualism. These are ideas that have literally shaped the futures of entire nations, from post-Soviet Russia all the way to modern China. So on one side, you've got shock therapy. It's fast, it's brutal, it's an all-at-once big bang. Think post-Soviet Russia. Then, on the other side, you have gradualism. This is the slow and steady, step-by-step approach, famously used by China to open up its markets. The choice between these two has been a defining story of the last few decades. The whole theory behind shock therapy is pretty straightforward. A quick, painful shock is way better than a long, drawn-out period of uncertainty. Just get the pain over with fast so the economy can start healing. But wow, does this approach carry a massive social and political risk. Now, gradual reform is the total opposite. It argues for a much slower pace. The idea here is to give society, institutions, and just regular people time to adapt, to try and keep things stable along the way. It's definitely less risky in the short term, but you have to ask, can it really deliver the big changes that are needed fast enough? But here's the thing, when you look at the track record for both of these approaches, it is surprisingly mixed. For every supposed success story, there's a big cautionary tale of failure. And that makes you wonder, if it's not just about going fast or slow, what is the real deciding factor here? Well, the source we're analyzing today offers a really powerful answer. So, what is the secret sauce? Our source material argues it's not really about the economic policy itself, but something way deeper. It's about how well that policy adapts to the society it's trying to change. And this is the absolute core idea. Success all comes down to adaptability. The government's plan, that's the formal organization, it has to be in sync with the people's mindset, their level of trust, and what they expect. It's a relationship, not a top-down command. This diagram really brings the idea to life. See that top path? When you have adaptability, things are in alignment and you get harmony. But when you don't, you go down that bottom path and you get discord and failure. The big takeaway here is that you can't just force a policy on people. It's about creating harmony between the government and the governed. And look, this isn't just some abstract theory. It was put to the test in the real world. In Iran, which tried to reform its massive fuel subsidies under two different governments, using two completely opposite methods. It created this perfect, fascinating, natural experiment. First, let's just set the stage. As you can see from these charts, these two attempts happened under very different economic skies. The first reform, under President Ahmadinejad, was during a pretty stable period. But the second one, under President Rouhani, it faced a much tougher climate. You can see the higher inflation and all that volatility right there. And this context makes the different results even more powerful. So the two administrations took polar opposite approaches. The first one was all about careful planning, getting public buy-in, and a gradual rollout. The second one, it was all about surprise, speed, and shock. The Ahmadinejad government spent months, and I mean months, preparing the public. And just listen to the language here. They didn't frame this tough reform as some kind of punishment. They framed it as a shared national project, a call for everyone to work together to build a better future. And their playbook was just, wow, it was so meticulous. They didn't just force it through. They built a consensus by passing an actual law, they talked to key groups to avoid problems, and, this is the most important part, they built trust by delivering compensation first. People had cash in their bank accounts before the price hike ever hit them. Think about that. Okay, now let's jump ahead 9 years. The Rouhani government went the shock therapy route. Their communication strategy? Total silence. The plan was an overnight shock. And the president's own words here, honestly, they're just staggering. He admits he didn't even know the exact timing himself. That just signals a massive, massive disconnect. And the results? Well, they could not have been more black and white. These diagrams show it perfectly. The gradual approach on the left achieved what the research calls institutional harmony. But the shock approach on the right, it created a complete breakdown of trust, what they call institutional antagonism. Now, these diagrams might look super scientific, but the story they tell is actually really simple. You don't have to be a mouth whiz, just follow the arrows. For the gradual reform on the right, see how all the lines are pulling in towards a stable point? But for the shock therapy on the left, they're just flying off into a chaotic, unstable spiral. It's a perfect visual of social order versus social chaos. So what's the big takeaway here? What does this one dramatic story from Iran teach all the other developing countries that are facing their own impossible choices? What's the universal lesson? And this is really it. At the end of the day, this debate isn't just about fast versus slow. It's about aligned versus imposed. You can have the most economically perfect policy in the world, but it's completely worthless if it doesn't have social legitimacy. A reform that's just forced on people is built on a foundation of sand. And this is why this is so critical for any leader, anywhere, who's thinking about reform. Trust, communication, and context, they aren't just nice-to-haves. They're absolutely essential for success. You have to treat the public as partners in the change, not as obstacles you have to get around. This quote just sums it all up perfectly, doesn't it? Real, lasting reform doesn't come out of a universal textbook or some one-size-fits-all plan from another country. It has to grow from a deep, and I'd say humble, understanding of your own people and your country's unique situation. So I'll leave you with a final thought to chew on. This whole analysis suggests that the most elegant, brilliant economic model in the world is fundamentally useless if it fails the basic test of human reality. True reform isn't just about changing the numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about changing hearts and minds.